Everybody, I'm very privileged to be addressing you once again this evening, and the topic that I'm looking at really is Christianity and end-of-life care and how it has envisaged that. And I suppose what we need to start off is what are the fundamentals that really influence the way Christianity and most of the great religions look at life and look at death. Well, first of all, life is a gift from God, that God is the creator, and therefore if God creates life, there is a sacredness about this life, and that would be a very strong theme running through Christianity, the sanctity of human life. Also, there's a strong theme of stewardship, that we are responsible for our own lives, and that we need to take responsibility that we don't violate this life or violate it in many ways. And therefore, certain religious traditions, out of that idea of stewardship, would argue very strongly against polluting the human body by smoking, drinking, overeating, etc., all the normal things which we take for granted. So stewardship now becomes a very important theme running through Christianity. But also very important running through Christianity is that human life is not an absolute. You do not have to strive to extremes to keep people alive. And running through that theme really is the idea that human life as we experience it, earthly life, is a transition to eternal life. And therefore death is a movement from one form of life to another form of life for eternity. And even though it's traumatic for the people who watch somebody die, very close relationships, there's also the belief for a lot of people that these people will inherit eternal life and that they'll be united with one another in the kingdom of God. Now, coming out of the early history, Christianity reacted to the Greco-Roman world and the Greco-Roman ways of envisaging the end of life. They particularly reacted strongly against suicide. As you know, some of the sophists, etc., would strongly argue that when you've achieved everything you want to achieve in this life, well, you should end your life. There's nothing more to achieve. And the way that they did it was to get into a nice hot bath, most probably a large glass of wine, and they'd slit their wrists and they'd bleed to death. Because you'd achieved all you wanted to achieve. Christianity reacted quite strongly to that and said that this would be against the whole idea of the sanctity of life, stewardship, and God's gift. And therefore suicide became quite a strong no-no in Christianity, as in most of the other religions as well. The early developments with regards to healthcare in Christianity really, I suppose, in the history we see the first hospital orders starting with the Crusades, where men and women started to look after the victims of the Crusades and the pilgrims, etc., and started to establish hospitals. And therefore, right across Europe, you start to see the emergence of hospitals for acute care, also for care with people with disabilities, particularly physical disabilities and mental disabilities, also people with mental illnesses. And as previously mentioned, the start really quite late of the hospice movement, of allowing people to die with some form of dignity and in a way in surroundings that is conducive to them. Now within Christianity there are a number of different traditions, and we could spend a lot of time discussing the different traditions. But I suppose their contribution to healthcare has been quite interesting. In Protestantism, with the start with Martin Luther and John Calvin, a very important element came out of that which we now take for granted. And because Luther and Calvin believed that your relationship with God, your individual personal relationship with God was the most important thing, and it was an individual thing, coming from that is the whole idea of respect for autonomy of the human person. That a person has a right to make autonomous decisions in their faith to God. And therefore the implications of this, as we know in current medical practice, really has been the whole problem of, or not a problem, but the issue of consent, the issue of confidentiality. And in healthcare today, you just cannot do anything to anybody without the informed consent. And sort of, what does informed consent mean? How much information do you need to give people? So Protestantism has had a huge influence. I suppose at another angle, when you look at the writings around, say, termination of life in the sense of abortions, the most important writers were Episcopalian writers in the United States, James Gustafson, Fletcher, etc., all writing from a Christian perspective, but about the rights of people to make decisions and to control their own bodies. Now, as the world developed, we had something which was called colonialism, and where the European powers went out and colonized huge parts of the world. But linked very strongly to that was the evangelical movement of the Christian churches to try and convert large numbers of people in the world, and they did it in a number of ways. One of the things was they established schools and they established hospitals, and these were done under the auspices of the various churches. And therefore, when you travel around the world, and most probably the best examples you would find of it are in Africa at the moment, which is closer to that colonial roots, large hospitals established by different religious traditions, trying to deal with healthcare, etc., in those traditions, and most probably influencing the way that things were looked at within those societies as well. Now, the ethical dilemmas which Christianity had to face really was, how do you look at suicide? What is suicide? We know that it is when somebody kills themselves. Was this against God? And if it was against God, well then how did God punish? We also know that civil society looked at suicide in a very similar way, and therefore if you read Blackstone's commentary on the common law, he would say that when somebody kills themselves, they commit two crimes. They commit a crime against God, because they went into God's presence uninvited. God determines when you live and die, and therefore you will be punished. And suicides were buried at the crossroads with a stake driven through their hearts. Civil society punished in another way, because you had deprived the king of your labor. The king had a right to your labor. Therefore, if you decided not to give your labor to the king would punish you. And how did the king punish? Well, you were dead. He couldn't punish you, but he punished your family. You're deprived of your property. And it's only recently that we have actually started to address that. And the law was changed recently on insurance, that when somebody killed themselves, by and large they were deprived of the insurance. And it's only within about the last 3 or 4 years that that law has changed, and therefore the insurance companies now pay out. So I'll just give you that example, but it is still a problem for Christianity, as is euthanasia and assisted suicide. How do they deal with these questions, which are increasing in countries? As we know, suicide and euthanasia and assisted suicide are legal in the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland, the state of Oregon, and Washington. One of the problems that started to emerge in Christianity was the whole thing of treatment options. How do we treat people? And they drew this distinction between ordinary means of treatment and extraordinary means of treatment. You were ethically obliged to accept and to offer ordinary means of treatment, but you weren't ethically obliged to offer or to accept extraordinary means of treatment. But the problem was, what is ordinary and what's extraordinary? Because things change. Like if you say, take the introduction of dialysis in the 1950s in the United States, that was considered extraordinary treatment, and therefore we wouldn't offer it to everybody. We'd draw a distinction. But now dialysis would be seen as quite a normal treatment and an ordinary treatment. So the question of ordinary and extraordinary started to be re-looked at, and they came up with the new definitions of beneficial and non-beneficial treatments, which you would now be familiar with, that we need to offer treatments which are going to be beneficial to the person, but we don't have to offer treatments which are non-beneficial. The problem really is beneficial and non-beneficial and futile treatments are very value-laden terms. Like, what is a futile treatment to me might not be a futile treatment to you, and vice versa. So these are quite value-laden, and therefore people's own vision of life and their own beliefs in Christianity start to come in. The other one was pain control. Could you control pain that could lead to the early death of a patient? When patients were in extreme agony, particularly, say, cancer patients, etc., or patients in war. And in the 1950s, this was dealt with within the Roman Catholic Church and in most of the other major churches, and they argued that you could administer pain control to the degree where it could hasten the life of the patient, but your intention was to relieve pain, even if it led to an earlier death. So that was sorted out quite quickly, and they used the principle of the double effect. Currently, we use the principle of the double effect to look at what's called deep sedation in terminal cases, that your direct intention is to control the pain of the patient, even though it might lead to an earlier death. So Christianity started to look at things like this, and was looking at it very much of a holistic vision, that you can't really allow people to suffer excruciating pain while they are moving towards their deaths. Another important one was death with dignity. How do we ensure that people die with dignity? In what circumstances do they die, that they're not alienated. And I think for most of us who have seen people die in hospitals, it is not a very pleasant experience to see somebody die in a ward where there are 5 other people and the television is going and there's lots of noise. I visited a hospital recently where there was an 8-bedded ward and a television at the end of the ward, but everybody had a zapper. So you had 8 patients all with a zapper. And luckily it was a male ward, so the football was on. So, you know, we were all happy bunnies. But if you wanted to watch the soaps, well, somebody would zap you out of the soaps. So this idea of how do we die, but very much linked into that is the whole question of nutrition and hydration. When can we withdraw nutrition? When can we, or not commence it? And as you know, there's a massive debate around whether nutrition and hydration is a medical treatment or is it basic care? And the Christian churches have never really come down on one side or the other. It depends on the circumstances in which they find themselves or how they think about these things. But from a legal point of view, we know that artificial nutrition hydration is a medical treatment and therefore can be withdrawn. But for certain traditions, it's seen as basic care and therefore can never be withdrawn. The other one that comes up really is patient autonomy. How much do we have to listen to the patient? And can the patient make demands on you as a doctor that you find unethical or you have a problem? So there is this debate between patient autonomy and doctors or physician autonomy, and what areas, and I suppose it's something that you all need to reflect on in your own lives, is what things won't you do as a doctor? What wouldn't you want to do to a patient? And we most probably all have quite strong views on euthanasia and assisted suicide. But the question you really need to ask yourselves, if you have such a strong view against assisted suicide or euthanasia, and maybe have very real arguments, why do some of your colleagues an hour's flight away have very different views? They normally belong to the same Christian tradition, but yet they have found in their own minds and in their own judgments that it is permissible to help somebody to die in a variety of circumstances. So what is the future, I suppose, for Christianity and for the large religions? What ethical dilemmas, when they're looking at end-of-life care, do they need to look at? And I suppose the major area really is equity of access to health care. How can we ensure that people moving towards the end of their lives have a system where they can experience in a unique way the drama of dying with those around them who love them and care for them? And I don't know what the statistics are for Ireland and in the UK, but the number of people who can actually access hospice care is quite low. And that is most probably something that we really need to examine. So we still have people who are not dying in the best places they want to die. And as most of you know, because of Dr. Shipman in England, we now have a system in this country where very few nursing homes want their patients to die in a nursing home. Because if you die in a nursing home, you've got to notify the coroner, and the coroner might order an inquest, and we don't want that. So what you happen is some elderly man or woman whose lives are moving towards the end, at 3 o'clock in the morning, they shipped into an ambulance and rushed off to accident and emergency. An accident and emergency going to overdrive to try and keep these people alive, when in fact their lives are moving towards an end, and what they need is really the comfort around them. So this is a question of how do we ensure access to healthcare which is equal. Also, death with dignity. We have the hospice movement, which is a great shining light to us, but very closely linked to that really is when you ask most people where they want to die, they want to die at home. They want to die in some alien environment. Because at home you can have all the things you want. You can have your family around you if they want you. You can eat what you want. Most of us are crack jokes about hospital food because we don't have to eat it unless you're a resident in a hospital. I was in a hospital not that long ago on a Friday, and fish is traditionally the food on a Friday, still in our hospitals. There was boiled white fish, mashed potato and swede on a white plate with a white sauce. Now I looked at that and I thought, gee, even I don't eat that. You know. And also people, one of the things that a lot of people want at the end of their lives is the ability to have a drink if they drink alcohol. And there's nothing worse than have to smuggle alcohol into a hospital in your pocket and give a man who's enjoyed a whiskey every night of his life Give him a glass of whiskey in a plastic glass with no ice. It really doesn't work. And yet and therefore home care, I think this is a question that we all need to look at. Also, how do we look at ensuring the autonomy of our patients is recognized, in the sense that if we believe that people are stewards of their lives, need to take care of their own lives, need to make decisions about their own lives, how do we recognize their autonomy? Because that's not anti-Christian. It's very much part of the Christian message. How do we ensure that that is happening? How do we listen to people? A lot of research demonstrates really is that healthcare practitioners do not listen to patients. They let patients talk, but they don't listen. And therefore they just make decisions. And there's a little bit of a movement in healthcare that end-of-life decision-making, if we can work out the physical structures of how you dying, and it's called the physiology of death, is that we don't actually have to talk to the patients. We can say that they have 2 or 3 more organ failure, there's 2 or 3 more organ failure, we just sign the DNR order. And we don't have to engage with them. Because part of the problem really is engaging with people when they are dying is that they ask too many questions, or they cry. And coming from an Anglo-Saxon, male Anglo-Saxon world, men in the male Anglo-Saxon world have a great problem with tears. Huge problem with tears. We find it very difficult to cope with tears, and therefore when somebody cries, you will tell them something else to stop them crying. So if you say to them, you're dying, and they start crying, you say, well, maybe you won't die. But these are the things. Also, I think a great challenge to Christianity is how we look at assisted suicide, physician-assisted suicide, and euthanasia. These are emerging things, very strongly emerging in Europe and in North America, and will become very much part of the reality of your medical experience. So how does your Christian faith actually look at things like that? So really, I think there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of scope for the future, but I suppose Christianity and all the great religions of the world, like Islam, Judaism, and that have contributed significantly to how people vision their lives, and particularly how they see their death as a transition from this life, perhaps to another life. Thank you very much.